I am particularly pleased to be with you this morning. In my former life, I was a university librarian, and as all of us in the academy know, the librarians are right next to the scholars. Isn't that right? Yes. So I'm a proud member of that profession, and I cut my teeth at Cornell University. So I'm particularly proud of that affiliation and of what it taught me. The UCF College of Arts and Humanities is the leader in our efforts to make sure that the humanities are a vibrant part of what we do at Festival. And I want to acknowledge the leadership of Dr. Scott French, who serves as the chair of the academics committee. You know, we're super nerds here, the academics committee. And I want to acknowledge the leadership, the intellectual leadership of Dr. Julian Chambliss, who brought to us for the 7th cycle the fact that we really should be looking at and exploring Afrofuturism as a working scholarly concept. Because we were able to persuade our board of directors, who does have an academic, has one academician on the board, but these are basically businessmen and women and civic leaders. But because we were able to get their endorsement of the idea that the cycle would be committed to Afrofuturism as an intellectual enterprise, that really positioned us to be a leader intellectually in terms of the community worldwide that is exploring Afrofuturism. I say that because I was the first student. I had no idea about what Afrofuturism was, and bit by bit, I have learned more and more, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. So today, I want to greet not only the people that are in person, but I want to greet those people who are joining us virtually on the campuses of, and I'm going to ask Dr. French if I missed someone, on the campuses of Bethune-Cookman University, Rollins College, Valencia College, Michigan State University, Spelman College, Johnson C. Smith University. Where else? Is it Ohio Wesleyan or Illinois Wesleyan? As I've given those institutions, those are the institutions where faculty members are represented. I hope that you were impressed, because other people are impressed that this configuration has the ability to bring scholars from around the country. And I would be, as they say, I would not live up to my obligation if I didn't also say that people in Helsinki, Finland, and Copenhagen, Denmark, have been following us. So what the University of Central Florida College of Arts and Humanities has done is really bring the world to the Zora Festival. And before I cede the floor to I think that you are my direct report. Is that correct, Dean Brodie at UCF? I want to acknowledge the real partnership, the personal relationship, and the trust that that I can have in the university as an institution because of the people who work with me directly, Dr. French, Dr. Anna Lilius, Mr. Jason Gregory, all at the University of Central Florida campus. Want to also acknowledge the other members of the academics committee. They are Professor Trent Domingo of Seminole State College of Florida, Dr. Michelle Cowan Gibbs from Wesleyan, Illinois Wesleyan. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Walter Grayson from McAllister College, and that is one of the colleges, one of the institutions that I did not mention. Dr. Aman Nathiri from Johnson C. Smith University. Anyone else? Dr. Clarissa West White of Bethune-Cookman University, and yes, Dr. Christopher Peace, who is at Georgia Tech, and an associate member, Miss Sydney Rose McCall, who is pursuing her doctoral studies at the College of William and Mary. Have I accounted for all? Thank you very much, Dean Brodie.
Good morning, everyone. You know, there's such silence in this room, it feels more ecumenical for some reason. We need to have some applause or cheer or something here. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. You know, we've been a proud sponsor, supporter of Zora, you know, since the very beginning in the College of Arts and Humanities. And so I just want to welcome you all to this fourth installment. And, you know, as I was thinking of some sort of welcoming remarks, one of the things that struck me was, since I think the focus, you know, today is on the spiritual concept of Afrofuturism. And I was thinking to myself, I wonder what it was like back in 1880, you know, when folks were sort of sitting around the campfire or whatever, and considering, you know, the establishment of a new community, you know, and the conversations between the folks in Maitland that really brought all the African Americans in to actually do the work, clear the land, plant the fields, you know, start the citrus groves and all of those kinds of things. And then, you know, it's sort of like our conversation today. I mean, who was the person that says, what if we started our own community? You know, and then what was the conversation with the other people in Maitland that says, well, we would like to start our own community. Well, here we are, you know, 100+ years later, and we know that a community was actually started. And I think as you go through the day, you know, you'll hear more about those concepts and how people reacted during those times, and just the development of things, and transfer that now to where we are now, and trying to re-secure some land that was used formerly, you know, as school property, you know, and where we are in the process of doing that, and what are the future visions, obviously Afro-future visions of where things might be going in the future. So I just want to welcome you all on behalf of Dean Moore and the College of Arts and Humanities, and looking forward to some wonderful presentations today. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Dean Brodie. My name is Bruce Janz, and I am here to greet you as the co-director of the Center for Humanities and Digital Research at UCF. We have been a supporter and sponsor of the Zora Festival and the Zora Academic Conference for a number of years now, and we've been very pleased to be able to take on that role. The Center for Humanities and Digital Research has a specialty in digital humanities, and we've worked with many people on many kinds of projects, including projects of veterans, including African-American veterans, cemeteries, things of this nature. We have just expanded into new space at main UCF campus, and this term we're loading it up with some fancy equipment and starting to have programming in that space, and we would invite you to come and visit us in Trevor Coburn Hall, room 325. I'm especially pleased to greet you personally because my own areas of research include African philosophy. And so from that point of view, I'm very interested in the discussions around Afrofuturism from the point of view of the continent of Africa, and thinking about what the future looks like and how it is narrated and mythologized and hoped for within that context. There are many interesting and important parallels. There are definitely some differences as well. And so I'm personally very pleased to see this series of conferences on Afrofuturism be so successful, frankly. And I think this one today is going to be no different from that. So thank you for coming. Welcome to those of you who are not from the Orlando area. I hope we can give you some good Orlando hospitality here. And I'm looking forward to a great day of conversation. Thanks very much.
Yes, we're deviating from the program. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm professor of English and also the Val Berryman Curator of History at the MSU Museum at Michigan State University. I'm also a core faculty in the Consortium for Critical Diversity and Digital Age Research at MSU. And I'm also, of course, the curator of this Afrofuturism cycle. I got a lot of titles, so I'm gonna stop it there. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you up front, there's gonna be some critical and racial things spoken about here today. And if anybody, any man, woman, or child feels uncomfortable, now is the time to get gone. All right, that was your out right there. Obviously, as the curator for the Afrofuturism cycle, it's my great honor to come back to a place that I lived and worked for a very long time in support of a series of conversations I think are very important. Spiritualism marks the penultimate. We're almost to the end of the Afrofuturism cycle. And of course, I always want to thank the Zora Festival for their willingness to go along in this journey with us, with me. Obviously, when I mentioned the term initially, there was a little skepticism and a lot of explaining. And it's interesting that perhaps the rest of the world has caught up to us in terms of our conversations about the importance of Black speculative practice or Afrofuturism. Obviously, when we start thinking about spirit, that is a space that many African Americans and the African diaspora have much to say. But in the context of Afrofuturism, it's often probably defined as a kind of recovery conversation, seeking to reconnect with legacies of identity, spiritual practice that have been cut off from people of African descent scattered around the world. At the same time, there's a cosmology and a way of looking at the world and a way of looking at how the universe works that's deeply rooted from different indigenous perspectives that are informed by an Afrofuturist spiritual approach. Given the complexity of the subject matter, what we have in the program this year is an attempt to sort of bridge the gap between those ways that spiritualism acts both as a kind of guiding practice that transforms, but also as a framework to understand. And so this is a program that I think will accomplish much in helping those people who are interested in spiritualism, Afrofuturism, have some valuable conversations. It is probably one of the best possible opportunities for us to turn over some of the talking to one of the people who've done a lot to help this program come to be in terms of Afrofuturism. And so I'm going to introduce Scot French, who's going to be the keynote for this morning. Now, Scot is the chair of the academics committee, as Professor Nathiri talked about, but he's also a historian. He is the director of public history at UCF. He is sort of associate director for the Center for Humanities. And well, I just call it Cheddar, and I always get the acronym wrong. But Scot is also a very, very well-known, very well-published scholar of African-American intellectual history. And since coming to Central Florida and coming to UCF, it's really delved into the complex narrative of the creation of Eatonville and the racial allyship that was at the core of the creation of the town of Eatonville. Key to some of his research is something he's going to talk about today, and something that he refers to as like a moral capitalism. And I think it's important for us to revisit some of these sort of crucial moments, because as we turn towards our contemporary set of circumstances, where there are perhaps, especially in the United States, questions about the impact of capitalism, the moral questions that is posing for people of all colors and all races, and all genders and the consequences of that system, that we recognize that for as long as we've been a kind of organized country, there have been people trying to navigate the pressures of capitalism. And key to those solutions or pathways that they approached were questions of morals, questions of values, questions of community. So I'm looking forward to this presentation from Professor French. I believe that he will start us off right as we continue our exploration of Afrofuturism. As always, for those people in the room and those people watching online, I appreciate your interest in the topic. And of course, we celebrate the legacy of Zora Neale Hurston by doing the things that Zora Neale Hurston did, thinking outside the box, creating things that were perhaps challenging for the people at the time, but spoke to values, concerns, and actions that needed to be accomplished. So, Scot French.
I can, there we go. Morning, everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you again this year, the 4th year of the Afrofuturism cycle. And Dr. Chambliss later in the day will talk about the 5th year, next year's session. But I'm just grateful to be here with all of my colleagues who have been involved with creating this. And we have a great staff from the University of Central Florida History Department helping out today. Mainly, I'm in this awkward position of stepping into the limelight here rather than simply being an organizer. And I really want to thank Julian for encouraging me to do this. I have to step out of my comfort zone here. I'm going to be presenting research I've been working on for quite a while and have presented in various forms, but to step up front here at this conference really means a lot. So I'll just get started. I'm going to start with a little history in the now, history in the news. I think this is really important for you to know what's going on in Eatonville right now. And this is an article that just appeared, I believe, this week on the Southern Poverty Law Center website. Esther Strader is the author of it. And I'm going to read this to you so you can understand fully what's going on. So the title here is Empowered Residents of Historic Blacktown Unite to Challenge Development Plan That Could Erase Its Legacy. When thousands of festival goers descend on Eatonville, Florida this month to celebrate the legacy of literary giant Zora Neale Hurston, they will, by their presence, honor the community dubbed the town that freedom built for its proud history as one of the oldest incorporated Black communities in the United States. While they are enjoying the annual festival that since 1990 has brought live music, literary symposia, theatrical productions, and art exhibits to Eatonville, where Hurston grew up, the 135-year-old town will be on the brink of a decision that will determine its future. On February 7th, just days after the festival tents are dismantled, the town council could determine the fate of a massive development that, if approved, will reshape and, activists and historians fear, erase the legacy of Eatonville. At stake is the fate of the Robert Hungerford Preparatory School property, where the leaders of Eatonville established a school in 1897 on about 300 acres. The proposal calls for building more than 300 residential housing units, both multifamily and single family, along with extensive commercial, office, and retail space on a tract that makes up more than 15% of the 1.6 square mile town that is 6 miles north of Orlando. Until now, even as surrounding communities in the booming area have been transformed by high-priced developments, Eatonville, where 73% of residents are Black, has retained its modest landscape of historic wood frame homes. The Southern Poverty Law Center's Economic Justice Project is working with the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community, or PEC, and the SPLC is supporting the PEC's efforts to ensure that the land is used in a way that benefits the community and safeguards its future. So we are right on target talking about Afrofuturism right now because there's an existential crisis for Eatonville at this very moment. We are part of this moment. And here are a couple quotes from the article. What we have done has been awakening the roots of Eatonville, said Julian Johnson, a 29-year-old financial services professional who grew up in the town and returned to live there after college. For too long, he said, the descendants of the people who attended that school who have roots in Eatonville have felt voiceless. Now our story is getting out there and our community is learning what's going on and how they can be effective in the fight. And now I want to play a little clip from Wesh News too. This is about 6 minutes. I want you to hear another leading advocate, John Beecham. I have the text for this too. So if we don't get audio, I can show you the text of the interview. Ready for everything. We'll give it a second, but
now it's owned by Orange County Public Schools and is development.
Sometimes when you start screen sharing, there's a little option that asks people to share audio.
Fighting the land, history, and the future. The controversy revolves around a historic piece of property in Eatonville where the first black student in Central Florida was built.
The land in question is about 100 acres on the corner of Wymore Road and East Kennedy Boulevard. Now it's owned by Orange County Public Schools for development. As West Marlene Martinez shows us, one man who refused to say the people want the land back.
How much you know that's
public school could be selling it to a developer for $14 million.
okay, sorry. That was a great setup, right? Because you hear it's about faith. You heard the spirituality. You saw the importance of land, the history, the harking back to the history of Eatonville. The other point I want to make here, and that's the quote, is that there are really two individuals right now who have taken the lead on this. John Beecham, who is in his mid-60s, and Julian Johnson, who's 29, right? So you've got two different generations here. They are not competing, they are working, collaborating, but they've each set up their own website. And interestingly, here's John's is called Eatonville 1887. And he's the one who's really pushing the land back as an idea, right? This, which is an idea borrowed from indigenous peoples and efforts to recover land. And Julian Johnson, his is called 1887 first. So you see that year is kind of a very important touchstone, and that's the title of my talk, The Spirit of 1887. And that's what I want to really get into today. And so my thesis is that there's a direct Afrofuturist social preservationist link or line between the 21st century placemaking and anti-gentrification efforts of John Beecham, Julian Johnson, PEC, and others, and the late 19th century placemaking and town building efforts of Eatonville's founders. We're going to draw the connection between the two. Now, one question is, isn't it anachronistic to call Eatonville's founders Afrofuturists when the term hadn't even been invented for another 100 years? And here, I'm just going to cite my colleague, Julian Chambliss, who says, no, it's not anachronistic. This is from a podcast interview. Oh, sorry. I'm not talking into the mic. It is not anachronistic to talk about Eatonville's founders as Afrofuturists because, as Julian points out, there's a certain kind of time politics in Afrofuturism that makes all Black people who are struggling toward liberation part of the same sort of intellectual movement. It's that mix of speculative practice and liberation that I think of as the core of Afrofuturism. And a little more from Julian on the same topic. You can argue, Julian says, that Eatonville is an expression, itself an expression of Black speculative practice, that it is a space of imagination. It exists as an imaginative space for people who read Zora Neale Hurston, but it is also, especially in the context of its creation, an expression of Black people and their freedom. The Black town building of 1880s and 1890s is an affirmation of Black practice that is a counter-future to white assertions of erasure or constriction. So I feel that I've now been given, I feel more comfortable making this claim and tying to the theme of the conference. This is about Afrofuturism in the late 19th century. And so just to sort of set things up here, this is a story really that begins, of course, it has a much deeper history, but with emancipation and Juneteenth and the idea of mobility as a kind of expression of freedom, right? This is one way in which Black people expressed freedom, was to be able to move. And we also know that this is a time in which a number of rights were enshrined. I'm not being able to see, I can't read everything here, but equal protection under the law, voting rights, all enshrined, slavery abolished, citizenship, how could I miss that one? So this is the backdrop. African Americans are citizens. They are moving. When we walk through this space, we have to remember that African Americans are entitled to the same rights and privileges as all other citizens. But of course, we know there was a great backlash. There are Black codes, segregation, disfranchisement, mob violence, and lynching. And that's another backdrop against which the founders of Eatonville are going to be struggling. In the 1870s and 1880s, African Americans migrated by the tens of thousands in search of freedom, community, and economic opportunity. And some looked west to Kansas and other places for refuge from anti-Black violence and what was called bulldozing. The Kansas migrants called themselves exodusters, and you can hear the Old Testament, you can hear the religious and spiritual quality of that movement that's behind that movement. Others like Joseph Clark of Tennessee, he was born in Georgia to enslaved parents in Georgia in 1859, but he moved from Tennessee to Florida, migrated south. We don't often think of that migration as a southward movement, but he moved to Florida for homesteads and steady work in citrus groves. This is why people were coming here, to work in the citrus groves and the railroads and the emerging town and resort communities. And this is just a little chart of Joe Clark's movement through this area. At 21, he's working in a grove and living with his employer. By 1885, he was a farmer and owned his own land. And by 1900, he was a merchant selling groceries. And again, 1910, merchant and general store. And he was doing much more than that, but this is just from the census. And that is a picture of him in his pineapple grove. By the late 1870s, railroad expansion was opening this region south of Jacksonville and Sanford. It was this area was called South Florida at that time. The railroads were opening this area to economic development and year-round settlement. And real estate developers were building stately homes for wealthy northern investors who were coming here for the warm weather, coming here in the winters, and coming here for good health, right? Enjoying the Florida sunshine, but also for a profitable year-round economic investment in citrus. How do you fund those winter homes? You have a citrus grove and you have year-round workers who maintain that citrus grove for you. And of course, for African Americans, it was the promise of work on the railroads, work in the citrus groves, and then these newly developed residential and commercial districts. And that's drawing African Americans from other parts of Florida and throughout the South. I have a little chart here from 1885 showing where residents of Maitland and Winter Park came from. All of them were really from the border state of Maryland or farther south. We get a little history of this early period of migration from Zora Neale Hurston herself. And this is from her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. Now, the Negro population, she writes, the Negro population of Maitland settled simultaneously with the white. They had been needed and found profitable employment. While the white estates flourished on the 3-mile length of Lake Maitland, the Negroes set up their hastily built shacks around St. John's Hole, a lake as round as $1 and less than a half a mile wide. It is now a beauty spot in the heart of Maitland, hard by United States Highway number 17. They call it Lake Lily. And this is Lake Maitland, and that's Lake Lily right there. It's called Lily Lake on this. So we're getting the beginnings of settlement here. And a little more from Zora. The Negro women could be seen every day but Sunday, squatting around St. John's Hole on their haunches, primitive style, washing clothes and fishing, while their men went forth and made their support in cutting new ground, building and planting orange groves. Things were moving so swiftly that there was plenty to do with good pay. So this is her picture of the first settlement in this area before Eatonville had even begun. So why were African-American workers who were making good pay living in shanties around Lake Lily and not in homes of their own? In one of the earliest issues of the Eatonville Speaker, dated June 22nd, 1889, town founder and Mayor Joseph E. Clark explained that the first Black settlers faced intense prejudice from their white fellow citizens who refused to sell them land. And here's the quote, and this is his history. This is really the first history of Eatonville. During the years between 1875 and 1877, an effort was made by Allen Rickett, J.E. Clark, and another colored man to purchase land for the purpose of establishing a colony for colored people. But so great was the prejudice then existing against the Negro that no one would sell them land for such a purpose. So what is Clark talking about when he talks about a colony for the colored people? And here we're going to look to Andrea Roberts, Dr. Andrea Roberts. She's a historian and urban planner, the head of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. And she tells us that freedom colonies were intentional communities created largely in response to political and economic repression by white mainstream society. From 1865 to 1930, African Americans accumulated land and founded 557 historic Black settlements or freedom colonies. So Eatonville is one of these. It's only a dream at this point. They come here, Joe Clark comes here with the dream of creating a freedom colony, but is thwarted. Now, there was another factor in this, this equation, which is the value of that land. The rising commercial value of Florida citrus grove land was getting in the way. And because this area was already gentrifying, the area was first already settled in the early 1870s by white homesteaders, but by the mid-1870s, wealthy investors were buying out those pioneer settlers in a land grab. So that's important to know that we're talking about gentrification today. They were already by the 1870s and early 1880s dealing with a gentrifying Maitland. And I have this confirmed by an observer of that time who wrote, this is from a newspaper reporter, this disinclination by whites to sell land was due partly to the feeling that the colored man would become too independent if he had property of his own, and partly to the fact that every inch of the land was used by the, quote, white folks for orange culture. So there's an economic motive, there's a racial prejudice motive, and they're kind of working together to deny African Americans access to land. So how did Clark and his fellow Black freedom colonists, who were denied in their efforts to purchase land and were thus forced to live in shanties or outbuildings provided by their white employers, how did they acquire the land to create the self-governed colony for colored people that they envisioned? Clark credited Lewis Lawrence, a wealthy white Northern capitalist philanthropist, with making the purchase of land possible. He wrote that in 1883, Mr. Lewis Lawrence, who came to Maitland from Utica, New York, a whole-souled philanthropist, came to the rescue by purchasing the land on which is now located the city of Eatonville. Why is it called Eatonville? Lawrence said, name it for Josiah Eaton, don't name it for me. And Eaton would agree, it was Lawrence who really was the driving force behind Eatonville. And Lawrence at once built them a church, the people who would live in Eatonville, he built them a church and several cottages, giving them a chance to pay for the same on easy payments. This wasn't a gift, it was a transaction, a real estate transaction on favorable terms that would enable these working people to afford to live there. So who is Lewis Lawrence? This was really my question when I moved to this area and I first encountered him. I said, I want to know more about Lawrence. What is motivating him? What were his political, ideological, and economic motives for opposing the exclusion of Blacks from land ownership? Remember, his neighbors, nobody would sell, and he supports efforts to create a colony for colored people in Maitland. And this is drawing from an article I wrote in Change Over Time. So Lawrence, he was born in upstate New York in 1806. He was orphaned at an early age and apprenticed to a carpenter for 7 years. But he moved to Utica and began to work and become very wealthy. He made his fortune in lumber and railroad industries. He became very active in the New York Anti-Slavery Society. He was in one of the meetings that was mobbed by pro-slavery forces. He was said to be very active in the Underground Railroad. And he even of relevance, I think, to Eatonville, he was involved in creating a town, a company town. He had already experimented with the idea of creating sort of a labor colony for his own workers. He was active in the Republican Party, the Party of Lincoln. He started a newspaper, the Utica Daily Republican, in support of Senator Roscoe Conkling, who was a civil rights advocate, the author of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which, if you know that act, is quite radical for its time, and much of it was overturned by the Supreme Court. But Lawrence was very active in support of Conkling. And here's where I want to bring in the term moral capitalist, because Lawrence is a very wealthy man. When historians talk about moral capitalism, what they mean is the fusing of 19th century entrepreneurial capitalism with middle-class family values and Christian piety. Lawrence was a philanthropist. You heard he was a whole-souled philanthropist. He gave generously to the poor in a century before the modern welfare state provided a safety net for industrial capitalism's outcasts. He viewed charity as a prudent investment that, managed wisely, would pay dividends for the recipient, the donor, and society alike. And Lawrence carried out these worthy actions done in Utica, New York, which was his base, and his winter home of Maitland, with a Christian's eye toward salvation and a capitalist's eye toward productivity and good labor relations. Time and again in the memorial tributes, friends commented on the skill with which Lawrence harmonized his Christian beliefs with his economic interests as an employer. And this is a quote: "He was indeed an encouraging instance of the way in which a capitalist can exhibit a Christian character in his dealings with laboring men." And this is from his friend and pastor, the Reverend Thomas J. Brown. Lawrence solved to his own satisfaction and theirs the difficult question of how friendly relations can be maintained between master and men. So now you sort of know something about his ideology, his politics. He looked to, as I said, he was watching what was happening in the South. He had a newspaper. I read every issue of it and found many references to what was going on in the South. He was very unhappy with the Republican Party abandoning the Black people of the South in 1877. He said it's just going to return to the control of their former masters, the planter class. But he did look to the South with some hope, and in Florida, he wanted to see, he thought Florida could be the most northernized of the southern states if it was guided by men like himself. He envisioned the rise of a modern, harmonious, class-stratified society built on the economic and political alliance of wealthy white northern capitalist investors and African-American workers who were employed year-round in their homes, in the railroads, hotels, shops, and groves. So this is, in his eyes, a political alliance. He's a Republican from the North. He wants to plant the northern pine in the South, and he sees African-American workers as allies in that political movement and to deny the return of power of the conservative white Democrats. And so together, in his eyes, these Republican Party loyalists would establish a biracial political alliance rooted in citizenship, Black citizenship particularly, voting rights, and property ownership. So you can see all these different motives behind his efforts to help the freedom colonists get a foothold. So he comes here, he's retired. Remember, he's born in 1806. In the 1870s, he travels the country, he travels the world. He ends up in Florida, comes to Maitland, and he thinks this is just like a paradise. It's the most beautiful place he's ever seen. It's an Eden, one of the most lovely spots in the world, all those beautiful lakes and tropical fruits. It seemed to me that the Lord had prepared those wave-like mounds of soil and those beautiful ponds of water on purpose to replant the Garden of Eden. All that was wanted of man was to possess the ground, keep it pure from all that is hateful to God and man, and the Lord would take care of the rest. In 1875, he buys an 8-acre parcel to create a model grove, and he begins making annual visits to Maitland. And this is up at the corner. If you know Maitland and Eatonville, it's on Lake Ave at the corner where there's now restaurants and other things. He meets Josiah Eaton, who is his neighbor living on Lake Catherine, and Eaton observed him and actually described him. He recalled Lawrence as a bright, cheery old man, then in his mid-70s, getting right in among the colored hands and in his shirt sleeves with his pantaloons rolled up and with a great broad-brimmed straw hat sheltering him from the sun. So he had direct interaction with those grove workers. He got to know them. One of the things that it really bothered him to see his grove workers, some of whom were less than 2 decades removed from slavery, living in, quote, outhouses and hovels without decent homes or a church of their own. And this is Eaton telling this story. He had noticed the averseness of most white people, Northern and Southern, to allowing the colored hands to acquire anything like proximity of white settlements. As he expressed it, most people wanted their hands to rise up out of the earth in the morning, and when their day's work was done, vanish like ghosts out into the air. He's commenting on his white fellow citizens and neighbors. So he decides to do something about it. In 1881, he platted a village for the colored people near his grove. He bought the land from Eaton and had it platted as a subdivision, made 48 small lots and homes available for purchase on easy terms, and erected a frame church for the village, the first in the area. There were covenants in these deeds that restricted the resale to colored people only and had moral strictures against liquor and gambling. He had used the same restrictive rules in his northern company town and actually fired a bunch of French Canadian workers who refused to abide by his rules against alcohol. So this was not simple. It could be read in racial terms, but he was also applying this to his white ethnic workers in the North. This is part of his social control, a very paternalistic idea, but it was also shrewd to do this in a sense to say, I'm sponsoring this subdivision, but this is going to not be a problem for all of you white people. It's not going to devolve into the black bottom settlements that you are familiar with. This is going to be a respectable middle class, neighborhood. And so what about the colored only restriction? Why would he have that in there? Well, first, he needed to establish the legal boundaries of this colored village or race colony. If they could be sold to white people, that would probably break up the colony quite fast because people could be coerced into selling. The land is so valuable, it could be sold very quickly and there goes the colony. So he was committed to this idea of creating a space that could survive, that would persist. The idea here is that this is protective and inclusive by design, not exclusive. We think of segregation and restricted covenants as a way of excluding people, but if you see the context here, it's to design a space to ensure that Black people will have a place to live in Maitland. Without such restrictions, the historic and cultural foundation of Eatonville as an all-Black community might well have been compromised before the town was even incorporated. Remember, this is 1881. Eatonville doesn't become a city a town until 1887. So for 6 years, it is a Maitland subdivision with Lawrence's patronage, but it's part of Maitland, and the people who live there are citizens of Maitland. They are voters, and to the extent that they pay taxes, they would have been taxpayers. So Eatonville, in the eyes of Lawrence and Eaton, Josiah Eaton, was really a model of what could be without prejudice. If you removed prejudice and made land available to Black people, they would thrive. And here's a description of Eatonville in 1886 by Josiah Eaton. He wrote, "At present, the village has 2 churches, a Masonic hall, a store, and a school of some 30 bright children whose willingness and eagerness to learn cannot be excelled. Its straight, clean streets lined with shade trees, its little fruit yards, beautiful with flowers, are in most striking contrast to the low, squalid, unhealthy, and disorderly colored quarters that pertain to most Southern towns." And so that was the vision here, that this is what will happen. If you remove these barriers, if you take the prejudice away and allow African Americans to own property, they will prove to the world, which is, conspiring against them, that they will thrive like every other citizen who has the opportunity. Okay, I mentioned that the residents of the subdivision of Eatonville they were citizens of Maitland, and they voted, and they were 1/3 of the voters who voted to incorporate Lake Maitland. So before Eatonville became a town of its own, the people of Eatonville helped to found Maitland. Josiah Eaton, who sold the land to Lawrence, he was elected mayor, and Tony Taylor, a resident of the subdivision, I'm calling it Lawrence's subdivision, Eatonville, is elected alderman. And Zora Neale Hurston writes about this episode in her autobiography. She wrote that the founders, the Maitland's white founders, people who had risked their lives and fortunes that Negroes might be free, supported this brief experiment in biracial democracy. The Eatons, Lawrences, Vanderpools, Hurds, Halls, Hills, Yateses, and Galloways never for a moment considered excluding the Negroes from participation. That seems a little sunny, given that they had not been willing to sell land to the people of Eatonville. But Zora's narrative is this is a very peaceful, harmonious relationship. And there was no conflict that drove African Americans from Maitland. They didn't leave because they felt forced out. They left because they wanted to. But that's my question. If race relations were so good, as Hurston asserts, why did the African American residents of Maitland's Eatonville subdivision decide to separate from Maitland and form their own independent township? And I think Joseph Clark gives us the answer. He tells us that from the very beginning, the residents of that subdivision had envisioned the formation of a colony for the colored people. That was already part of their vision from the moment they arrived in the 1870s. And that part of that vision was political autonomy and self-governance under their own vine and fig tree, which is sort of the idea that's associated with the formation of the Black church. The same with Black townships. They wanted to live under their own vine and fig tree. They wanted to be truly sovereign, right? Not be one alderman on a committee, or, that they would run this town. This would be their community, their place. And so on August 18th, 1887, Eatonville incorporated as one of the first state-chartered African-American municipalities in the United States. Remember, there are many freedom colonies and settlements, but this is a chartered, incorporated community. 27 African-American men, including many of Maitland's founders, signed the town charter. Columbus Bossier is elected mayor. Joseph Clark serves as alderman. And this is the deed from the microfilm in Orange County showing the seal of incorporation, Orange County notice of incorporation. And this is, if you go to Eatonville today and the gateway, you will see a tribute to the signing of the town charter. This is a pivotal moment. This is the 1887 moment to which John Beecham, Julian, Johnson, and others are pointing. 1887, that date is the date of independence. It's Independence Day, really. So how did Eatonville's founders articulate their Afrofuturist vision of Black liberation and communal prosperity? And here, and there's several ways that they do it. The story of Eatonville goes viral, and Joe Clark is the chief publicist. He gets interviewed a lot about what's going on. What is this town? What's the motive behind it? And it does get, it's quite the curiosity. This is an article, a model Negro town in Florida, Louisville Courier, 1902. And every one of these articles says, not a single white person in the town. What is this? Why is that so remarkable? The idea, though, of course, is that they're thriving. Every time they tell their story, we learn how well they're doing. That they defy the racial stereotype that they can't govern themselves, that this experiment will fall apart. No, it's thriving at every turn. And all these photographs show them in their homes and their places of work and their church. And the world is learning about Eatonville. And they give their own story. They tell their own story through the Eatonville Speaker. This is the only surviving issue of the Eatonville Speaker held by Maitland Art and History. It was behind a frame in the museum, and I had it digitized. It's actually 4 pages. And if you go to UCF's Riches digital repository, you can read all 4 pages. But right here is the key. The founders announced their higher purpose in an open letter to the colored people of the United States in this only surviving issue. This is Vol 1, number 2. So this was probably published in the first issue as well. So Clark and the editors, they call on prospective home buyers to help solve the great race problem through Black political and social autonomy and the common pursuit of economic mobility and prosperity through land ownership. So colored people of the United States solve the great race problem by securing a home in Eatonville, Florida, a Negro city governed by Negroes. That's a big purpose, solve the great race problem. It's not simply a real estate transaction. It's not just another development. It's not like Winter Park, which was a resort community. This is a community with an ideological and political motive behind it. And this is published 6 years. It's 1889, so it's 2 years after independence. And he says 6 years since the founding of the colony. It's actually more like 8 years if you count from the very beginning of the creation of the subdivision. But basically, it's a report. After 6 years, Eatonville is now an incorporated city of between 200 and 300 with a population of 200, 300, a mayor, board of aldermen, and all the necessary adjuncts of a full-fledged city, all colored and not a white family in the whole city. And that's a photo of the town council. Okay, sorry about that. Now I got to go back. I don't know if I can go back here. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Am I doing that right? Oh, geez, I'm going ahead here. How do I go back? Okay, I just wanted to show you that picture again, sorry. This is the mayor and city council of Eatonville. And I mentioned Winter Park, right, which was started out as a privately organized venture to settle that community. And when you read this, it starts to have similarities to those brochures that the developers of Winter Park were putting out. And so they would do things like, well, what am I going to get? How am I going to entice you to come settle here? They would stress the abundance of wild fish and game that could supplement the food that was grown in gardens. And the message here is that you could survive hard times here. The hard times could be weathered. This is an earthly paradise in the community of other colored people. It's safe and you can survive. You know, if you lose your job, there's food, there's your own land, your own garden. So it's sustainable in that way. And I think it's important. So they talk about all these beautiful lakes and they say adjacent to a city and still calling it a colony, which I think is interesting. So that concept of this as a colony is still very much part of their thinking, even 2 years after it's a city. It is a city, but it's also a colony. The colony idea is really driving it. And it's being marketed to every intelligent Negro seeking a solution to the race problem. They repeat that phrase. And here we get down to the nuts and bolts of buying land there. But the point I want to make here is that this is also part of the higher purpose. This is not for speculators. They're aiming this at actual settlers, and in parentheses, colored. You're not just going to buy this land, rent it out, and leave. You need to be part of it. And so all of that, I think, adds up to the idea that there's something bigger going on here. They know it's something special. And if you're going to join this, you need to be part of that vision. And Zora Neale Hurston's father was one of those who came and bought land. He bought two lots from Joseph and Martha Clark in 1899, and then 6 more in 1905. And he owned all of this block here, block 10. And you can go and sort of see a sign when you go to Eatonville. It's a vacant lot now, but you can see the original lot that the Hurstons owned. And that's important too, because it leads to Zora Neale Hurston's important role in helping to preserve the memory and the history of Eatonville, that she plays such an important role in republicizing the founding of Eatonville and its sort of unique status, right? This is a very famous phrase, time and place have had their say, and Rashida Phillips today will be picking up on that theme. But she talks about being born in a Negro town and what it meant to be a product of that place, right? And she writes about Eatonville in autobiography and in her fiction. Here's from Jonah's Gourdvine. You mean a whole town, nothing but colored folks? And, you know, and here their eyes were watching God, Joe Starks, Joe Clark, Joe Starks. So she keeps returning to Eatonville throughout her work. And we all know that, those of us in the room know that. But I think that this is the spirit of 1887, that she returns to the founding of Eatonville. That's part of the story here. She talks about the excitement of those who were drawn to that, like her father. And so I see that as part of the spirit of 1887, circa 1930s and 1940s. And of course, Zora Neale Hurston now is you know, her story is really much more dominant than Joe Clark's story, but they're sort of working in tandem. And so that brings us to today, the spirit of 1887 today, invoking Eatonville's past to shape its future. And this is a meeting, Julian Johnson and NY Nathiri speaking during a meeting about the proposed residential commercial development. Of course, Preserve Eatonville Community is all about referencing the past. This is a place that matters. It has a history and a legacy that should not be erased, cannot be erased, must not be erased. So how have we all been working together to tell this 1887 story and remind people of that this was part of an alliance, right? So John Beecham and this gets a little personal into my involvement in this, but I had done a few exhibits, museum exhibits on the founding of Eatonville, and I created an exhibit at Maitland Art and History, and John Beecham came into the museum space, looked up on the wall and saw a poster about his relatives, and we got to talking, and a partnership really emerged from that. He said, you need to take this history out you need to take it out into the community, and I'm going to help do that. I'm going to arrange public talks. And he arranged talks at Asbury Maitland Church and a whole series of talks with Dr. Nathiri and myself and John Beecham, where we were addressing different themes, telling the stories of Maitland and Eatonville and getting people to connect, people in Maitland who had no idea about this history, and trying to get them interested in the present, that Eatonville's future is important to you. It's part of your history, our shared history, and getting people to care, right? And that led to the idea of walking tours. John suggested that we take it to the streets, and we, I think now 3 years ago, he said, let's do an MLK walk. We're just gonna do it. And we're gonna announce it, and whoever shows up, shows up. And that first talk had 2 people. But by the second year, we had about 40 or 50 people. And this is the poster from this year's talk. And John would post these social media, you know, these are what he would post on Facebook and other places. The idea was, you know, and that's really what his website does, is says, come walk Eatonville, listen to the stories of Eatonville. His mantra is, we need more storytellers, which I totally agree with. And so he's become one of those storytellers, but he's trying to create more. And this is his welcome at the last walk. I'm not going to play this, but if you listen to it, it's about how this is coming from his faith. Again, it's very much rooted in his, sense of belonging to Eatonville, but also driven by his faith. And that's very powerful for me. When he leads these talks, he invites pastors to bless Maitland and bless Eatonville. And it's just fascinating to me. I come in as sort of a historical consultant, and I'm sort of swept up in this movement, you know. It's hard to sort of stand back, not that I want to, but it's hard to be a dispassionate, you know, scholar of Eatonville 1887 and not get pulled along into the present by people who are really trying to wake people up, right? And John worked hard to get people's attention. It wasn't until he came up with the land back idea that the media started paying attention. The signs started popping up at Hungerford School property. Suddenly, all kinds of new attention, new excitement and concern about what was going on. The last stop on our tour is at the Hungerford School property. And here you can see that John and others had placed land back signs next to the city's banner, future home of Eatonville Town Square. And you can see those competing visions, future home of Eatonville Town Square or land back. And so this is just to give you an eye. The question here is, you know, is this scale of development in Eatonville's future? This is not the pending plan, but it's going to be something like this. Take a look at this, you know, artist's conception. If you've been to Eatonville, try to imagine what this will do if it comes into Eatonville. I just want to end here with the idea that the conversation is ongoing, that Preserve Eatonville community has taken the lead in organizing a series of conversations around principles of land development in historic Eatonville. And starting on February 14th through November 14th of this year, a whole series of panels. This is funded by the Florida Humanities Council, and hopefully in discussion, Dr. Nathiri will talk a bit about this. So I believe that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with me. So I think
if you have questions for Scott, they need a microphone.
we can have this one. Oh, I guess I should keep this one. Yeah. That would not make sense. Yes.
Oh, yeah, there's a question.
Scott,
Yes.
you of course know that Hurston wasn't born in Eatonville.
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
Why do you
I'm
think-
sorry. That's exactly her childhood home, I believe I called it in there, but it is her child. She would say it's her native village, but she's born in Notasulga, Alabama. And
1891.
Professor Anna Lilius is a Hurston scholar, and her work is incredibly important to me. And she interviewed residents of Eatonville for a volume and is writing a biography, right?
A book about the Harlem Renaissance.
About the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I'm
Why
glad
do
you
you think-
pointed that out.
Why do you think she did that?
I think she felt more connected to Eatonville. I mean, I think it was a better origin story for her.
Uh-huh.
It was too complicated to talk about that migration. Oh, Michelle?
Thank you. That was riveting, Scott. I was curious about the language of colony
Yes.
and what you think holding on to that language was about. I have thoughts, but I'm curious what yours are.
Well, I guess that it's more, I think of it, and I've really only been zeroed in on this of late because I went back and read that call very closely and began to see that term. It jumped out at me. It seems to me that they don't want this to become a kind of secular thing, that the city is a kind of secular idea, an incorporated city. The Freedom Colony is a almost spiritual idea. I guess that's where the spiritualism comes in here. It's not articulated in quite those terms, but I do think it's something else. And I think they wanted to sort of indicate that it was both. Do you have, I'd like to hear your idea.
Yeah, I was thinking like, I wasn't thinking that at all, but I was thinking maybe that a city is something that's still very governed by entities, right? And a colony seems to be something that separates itself from the entity, even though, but it might be governed from a distance, right? Like there's sort of not direct governance. So it seemed to me like there was a way of disconnecting yourself from control by calling yourself a colony. But I like the spiritual explanation much better. So
I'm still thinking this through.
Yeah,
I really,
I think it's a really interesting observation that you made, and I'm curious about it. And then the only other thing I wanted to say is that, I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky. So I think that that article in the Courier Journal is just fascinating. I'd never seen that before. And I've done some digging in the late 19th, early 20th century in the Courier Journal. And I never caught that article about Eatonville. So that's
full
cool.
page photographs, amazing.
Very cool article.
Yeah.
I would love a copy of that.
Yes.
So, it's very important, the relationship that Lawrence and Eaton had with Joe Clark and people who found it. And even though the town started, just for Black people and only Black people can own the land, sort of like a self-segregation, and understood the need for that. The reality is that they existed within the context of Orange County, right? And even though, there's this idea that we're governing ourselves, it still is very much, in a precarious position because you still exist within the county and then within the state. So even though there is a lot of freedom there, there still has to be some relations maintained with those in other areas, whites in other areas, so that they can continue to thrive, so that they don't get choked out. So how is that concept of working with people in the state, people in the county, how is that working out now with this crisis that Eatonville is in right now?
It's very complicated. The county school, the Orange County Public Schools is on legal grounds saying we have the right to sell this property. It was transferred to us by the trustees of the Hungerford School. And I think that the issue might be to go back and I think John Beecham does this. He says, when it was transferred, when the property was transferred back in 1950, it was intended to continue to be for the purpose of educating colored students. And I think his argument is that that's been violated, that the land began to be sold off. It was first sold off to create I-4. And I found an interesting history written by Frank Otey, who was the town historian and was the principal of Hungerford School during that time. And he said that, I think it was a teachers group lobbied to make sure that the money from the sale of that I-4 land was returned to Hungerford to improve its facilities, things like auditoriums and gyms and things. That money was just going to go away. They had to fight to get it returned. And I think there's been that struggle that the county just saw this as land that had a lot of value and that they could sell it off and that the school didn't need that much of it. And at some point, they didn't even need the school at all. And I think that's the sense that, that they don't have that vision of the land as something with meaning attached to it. And I think there's another side to this, which is a pragmatic one, which is that it's part of a historic landscape. And it's important in thinking about economic development to think about the value there, that this could become a heritage tourism destination if sites like the Hungerford School were developed properly, if there was smart development. Dr. Nathiri is raising her hand. She can speak to this point.
So this is when scholarship, pragmatism, citizenship all converge. We have the privilege of living in a democracy. I want to assure you that that land is coming back. I have every confidence. I'm not being Pollyanna. This is not about Brigadoon. This is about the fact that of economic justice. This is beyond reparations, right? We transferred that land, and I say we, because our family has been in Eatonville for about 100 years, and we're newcomers, okay? We're not like Mrs. King, whose grandmother was born in Eatonville. Okay? So when I say to you that we're going to get that land back, we're going to get it back because there's an economic justice imperative here. And when the good people of the United States hear about this, we're going to get it back because of the court of public opinion. But I also want to assure you, for those who know me and my kin, that we're not playing. It really is about economic justice. You cannot take land that we transfer to you, and the people who do the scholarship will tell you, they'll dig in, they can look at the times, okay? We say in some areas that this is not Jim Crow. This is Mr. James Crow Esquire, okay? And if you can remember, because this is really a part of the American saga. And it's a part that says that when the citizens stand, they have an impact on the government, all right? You're not gonna take us, we're not in Russia. You're not gonna lock us up and put us in some gulag. We are in a democracy, and the democracy can work. So what does that mean? It means that in the 1950s, so that a judge says you don't need to have a private school anymore. When you talk about the history, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune actually wanted to have the Hungerford School as a prep school for Bethune-Cookman College. All of this in this room, as we're talking about scholars, all of this stuff, this is not just concept, all right? And so when you talk about, and I really want to say this in all due respect, because we have wonderful working relationships with individual people in Orange County Public Schools. But in terms of the institution, it really is acted as a predator. It is acted as a predator. As Mrs. King says, when Orange County Public Schools has been selling the land, nothing has come back to Eatonville. And so now you're going to suppose that you can take land that we transferred to you in the 50s for, quote, the education of Negro children, and you're just gonna sell it off. And it means that all of the work that we have done as an organization over 30 years to build an economic heritage in terms of cultural heritage tourism, and the fact that in the hospitality industry, cultural heritage tourism, that is an economic factor. And you're going to say that you're going to put apartments, and no, that's not going to work. And you know why that's not going to work? Because Willa and, oh dear, the Bruces in California, the people who had the beach resort, and you know, the government through eminent domain, the government can do anything that it wants to, all right? So in eminent domain, they took that land, but when people understood what had happened to them, California, that they have that land back. 100 years later, they get their land back. Now, the other reason that I can be so confident about this, is that 35 years ago to the year, Orange County government wanted to 5-lane the 2-lane road that existed in Eatonville. If you go to Eatonville now, you will see that that road is a 2-lane road that has been landscaped. Now, why did that happen? That's because the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community and the city of Maitland and other people around the country, so I can stand and bear witness to you that we can beat the government. Been there, done that, got the cigar. Okay. Absolutely. So that is actually the case. The other thing, though, is about the collaboration. Okay. And I want to give you just one other story, and then I really would like to ask you to talk about why it is that Eatonville was not destroyed like Ocoee and Rosewood. That really is a question. Yeah, Eatonville, and we have our thoughts, but I do want to say this so that you understand the power of collaboration, the power of cooperation, and your personal responsibility to help this happen by becoming a recurring monthly contributor to the association to preserve the Eatonville community, but that's another commercial. This is actually the case about personal relationships. So you see how I present, okay? In 1987, and this is actually the case, I'm sure that they must have done some research on me, they must have, but the city manager in Maitland, on that Sunday before we actually made the formal organization of Preserve Eatonville Community, this is what happened in the city of Maitland. They gave me the keys to City Hall because I had to get some photocopying. You know, I'm a paper person. I'm not going to go to a meeting and not have an agenda and a kind of thing. But they gave me the keys. Understand what I mean? They gave me the keys, said, call us when you are done. That is the level of cooperation that happened with the city of Maitland, Preserve Eatonville Community, and the town of Eatonville never sued anybody. Preserve Eatonville Community sued, the city of Maitland sued, all right? So individual relationships and the power of them and the commitment to integrity. No, we can't undo the past. You are not responsible for what your people did, and I'm not responsible for what my people did. But practically speaking, we have the aegis, is that the word? We have the ability to impact. And what you see when Dr. French talks about the emotionalism, you have to be rational. You have to be able to navigate. You make your relationships. You can't be burning down. You can't burn relationships. You have to be able to count on people who are effective, who know how to navigate the relationships and navigate, but you can be purposeful. You can be purposeful. And now that's my story, and
Could I answer your question about why Eatonville was not targeted in the way that Ocoee was targeted? One thing that struck me was the presence of these Republican northern transplants. Josiah Eaton was a retired naval captain who was on board with this and facilitated this. So he does deserve credit. And I believe he was Clark's employer. And so I think Eaton played a critical role in making this happen. But Eaton was a protective person. Eaton lived there year round. He was the mayor. That's important. He endorsed this. And these wealthy, prominent citizens, northern white citizens of Maitland endorsed Eatonville, and the streets bore their names. They named things after Lawrence and Eaton, in part to say, we have powerful white friends, patrons. The St. Lawrence Church is named for Lewis Lawrence, patron saint. Lawrence Avenue, Eaton Avenue, Eatonville. All those names were there in some ways as in a protective way. All of the properties around Eatonville were owned by northern white settlers. There was like almost a protective ring around them. And I do think the demographics of the area helped because, and I didn't put it up here, but it's really interesting. It's because this is a newly settled area, people are coming in from everywhere. It's not already settled and controlled by people who had lived there for generations. In 1885, it's about half native white Southern, and then the other half Northern or Western, Midwestern white and African American. So 25, 25. So together, it's really balanced. The alliance between African Americans and Northern white Republicans really offsets this kind of threat from those who really didn't want to see Black people rising in this way. I think that those helped protect them. It's not to say that people were not vulnerable. If you read that first issue of the Eatonville Speaker, I think there's a reference to an incident in Sanford The violence is there and it's nearby. It's not far away. But I do think that that patronage was very important, and the people of Eatonville recognized the value of patronage. And I think that the relationships that build out of that, I think it cuts against the idea of Eatonville as being isolated and aloof. It was always connected in some way to Maitland. Those relationships, even into the 1980s, not to say that there was all kinds of other things, but those relationships were important. They came into play in the road widening fight, and they're being tapped into now by John Beecham through the church.
My voice carries, so I had a quick question. So I drive on I-4 a lot, and I see the development, and I was actually wondering where the Hungerford Memorial was. I grew up in the sort of unincorporated Orange County, Maitland area. I work there. I'm from Seminole State College, and they've got a brand new futuristic, kind of puts the futurism and Afrofuturism for today, building being built on there. And I didn't know what it was for the longest time. And I looked it up and I finally realized it's a data center. It's a really high-tech data center. So I'm curious, is that on the Hungerford land, or is that like part of the weird Orange or Winter Park, BMW sort of adjacent lot outlet? And is that the development that the sort of activists in Eatonville, are they worried about that? Do they like that? Is that the kind, how do they feel about this sort of high tech? Because I know there's always been talk about high tech corridor being built all along Maitland going back decades. So is that the kind of development they're afraid of? How do they view that? Is that what they would like rather than apartments and shopping centers? I was just curious about that.
I will just say that parcels of the Hungerford property have been sold off since the closing of the school. What we're talking about is the last 100 acres. I think it was 300 to begin with, and they're down to the last 100. I think if you think about what you saw for the residential commercial development, that's a much bigger scale. It's much closer to the historic core of the city. And so I don't know how people responded to that particular development. I don't think it was seen as quite the threat that the commercial residential development is, because of gentrification and everything that will come with that huge footprint. Yes, Anna?
Oh, I was actually going to ask about the 1980s development, so we've talked about that a lot. I did, though. I'm also glad to see that out of both of these battles over land use, it seems like really powerful movements in the arts and humanities have blossomed out of these struggles. You know, this festival itself came after, if I understand correctly, after the 1980, grew out of that 1980s battle over the highway that we're here today. And now there's the walking tours and these talks that are happening. And obviously I hope that they end in having the result of Eatonville getting this land back, but as a secondary benefit, I'm glad to see what has grown out of.
Well, one quick thought on that the festival and Dr. Nathiri can speak to this, was a marketing tool after the successful defense of Eatonville against this road widening project. The Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community was formed 34 years ago, 1987. And the idea was that the festival would remind people of why this place was important, right? And so the arts and humanities were invoked, and of course, Zora Neale Hurston being the most famous example of that. However, you'll see an article, I think next month in Winter Park Magazine that I wrote, really in collaboration, an interview with Dr. Nathiri about how the festival came to overshadow the other things that Preserve Eatonville Community was doing. And that in some ways, to turn it back to Eatonville has been her mantra, to remind us all that at core, this is about saving Eatonville. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. In terms of, let's do the chronology. In fact, the festival was a marketing tool that was developed in 1988 and saw light in 1990. In other words, and this is an actual fact. Some of you may find this hard to believe, but in 1987, the decision makers, the elected officials in Greater Orange County had never heard of Zora Neale Hurston. And never heard, they didn't know who Zora Neale Hurston was. Okay. And so the festival, so many of us were from the education community, and we wanted to see how we could educate the general population about Zora Neale Hurston, the historic significance of Eatonville, because Eatonville didn't have any cachet. I mean, it's just Eatonville is a low socioeconomic area. You know what I mean? That's what it is. You know, it's where those people live. So we tried to figure out how could we educate the public without being, no offense intended, pointy-headed intellectuals. You know, that you start talking and 5 minutes later, people going to sleep. So we said festival, you know, let's have fun. That we edutainment. And so that really is how a festival came. It was a marketing tool. And we had 3 goals: to celebrate the life and work of Zora Neale Hurston, the writer, the anthropologist, the folklorist, to celebrate her historic hometown as significant, historically significant. And what we've heard this morning is just a bit of that, you know, about the Reconstruction era, the whole business of the American saga story, and to celebrate the cultural contributions which people of African ancestry have contributed to the United States and to the world. All right, so that's what, and that's still what it's all about. But it took off so well, not because of just us necessarily. Why it took off really was because of the Zora Festival National Planners, the first class. Those people, specifically Dr. Richard A. Long and Dr. Mary Jane Hewitt, both deceased, as a matter of fact, but they had in their Rolodex, for those who don't know what a Rolodex is, you know, you got your, okay. They had in their Rolodex, Dr. Maya Angelou, Brock Peters, Ossie Davis, Ruby Dee. These are what, in that generation, you would call them the race people. Those are people who were committed to advancing the heritage group. And what they did was to get on the phone and call those people, all right? And what those people did, and I want to use the example of Dr. Maya Angelou, who came to us 3 times, 3 different times. The woman never charged us a penny, and she paid her own way. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? At that time, if she opened her mouth to a corporate, it was $50,000. And if she gave you the discount as a nonprofit, it was $25,000. Excuse me, we didn't have, all right. So she came 3 times. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis, these people came, we call it pro bono. And actually we've been spoiled. I understand that you're supposed to give honoraria. I understand that. But what I was practically raised, because of the mission, people gave their service. And so we are known as one of the best arts and humanities special events in the country. And in fact, we're now America's longest running. We are America's longest running arts and humanities festivals. There's nobody to compete with us, not arts and humanities, okay? You've got the Atlanta Arts Festival. In Winston-Salem, you have the Theater Festival, all right? But we are arts and humanities. That's why this work is so critical. It's so critical. So that's the child out in the public mind stands more. But we really are about posterity, making sure that Eatonville is viable as a historic community as long as the United States is viable. All right, so we're not here for a road marker. We're really very serious about this, and we're very confident about it because really we have that ability, as is demonstrated here.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you all for being here this morning. Oh, there's a question online. I don't think I can. No, okay. I'm going to switch hats here and as an organizer, say thank you all for coming to this morning. Please come back at by 1:15. We have a great Teaching Afrofuturism panel led by Trent Tomengo. And then at 2:45, Rashida Phillips will be here. So please stay with us. There's lunch in the program. You'll see all the lunch options in this area. But anything else we should tell people right now? Thank you so much for coming today.